jurisdictions what can be done in order to fight climate change. Oregon has had an ambitious climate agenda actually for quite a while, starting in the late 90s actually. We've done a lot of really good work with energy efficiency, creating the Energy Trust of Oregon, putting a premium on ratepayers to help with energy efficiency, efforts having to do with creating renewable portfolio standards, setting carbon reduction goals 10 years ago, well 12 years ago now, in 2007, that were among the most ambitious in the nation. We decided at that time, we chose as a legislature to commit to, by the year 2050, seeing our carbon emissions reduced to 75% below what they were in 1990. Okay, so taking us back to 1990 and then reducing those emissions by a further 75%. Very ambitious, but that we knew was what climate science was telling us. Back in 2007, the legislature, 2007 was a great year for the environment. Just to be political for a moment, the Democrats, after a number of years, took over leadership in the House, and so it became possible that we already had the majority in the Senate. It became possible to actually pass climate legislation. Because I don't need to tell you that climate policy is among our most politically polarizing of issues. So it's a real challenge. So in 2007, not only did we set those ambitious goals, but we created a renewable portfolio standard, saying that by the year, gosh, I don't even remember offhand what it was, but our electricity had to come from renewable sources. And that included, it did not include our hydro, because our hydro, that's legacy renewable. You know, that was done thanks to some hard work by people a number of years ago. But to count as part of our new renewable standard, it had to be new hydro, or solar or wind or geothermal. And so we did that. We also created the Oregon Global Warming Commission to report to us on how we're doing in reducing our carbon emissions. And we created the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute at Oregon State University that brings scientists together from around Oregon, and their job is they don't do original research themselves as an institute, although many of the members of OCRE do, you know, in their professional life, they do climate research. But their job was to keep the legislature abreast on the latest climate science. It's been a really great resource. In 2016, we passed the Coal to Clean bill that upped our renewable portfolio standard from where it had been to that by the year 2035, we would need to have half of all of our electricity come from renewable sources, and none of it could come from coal. And so by the year 2030, Oregon would phase out all of its reliance on coal by that time. It was a great bill, a great piece of work. At the same time, for a number of years, starting in 2009, which is when I entered the legislature, we have been working on a carbon pricing program to sort of overlay all of these efforts. Because we knew that we would have to get around the problem of the way that the true costs of carbon, you know, what's sometimes referred to as the social cost of carbon, or the real effects, if you take into account health effects, environmental effects, the effects on future generations. None of that is part of the price that we pay for our which is why our energy costs are so much lower here than they are elsewhere, because it's, you know, we only take into account the cost of extracting the resource. So we knew we had to do something, but in 2017, we got a real wake-up call from the Oregon Global Warming Commission and the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute. The Oregon Climate Research Institute came in first, and they told us, hey, you know those ambitious goals that you set back in 2007? Well, they're not good enough anymore, because global warming, it feeds on itself. And you know, the more the ice caps are melting, the less light reflects, the more the ocean heats, it just absorbs more heat. And so instead of reducing by 75%, the new standards would require us to reduce by 80% of 1990 standards. And that was bracing, but then they were immediately followed by the Global Warming Commission. You know, they told us, well, guess what? You're not even on track to meet your reduction goals to the 75% level. And we knew that we really had to get serious about creating an umbrella program that would put a cap on our emissions and have put us into a sort of discipline that would reduce our emissions year by year by year. And the way to do that is through some sort of carbon pricing. So we started working in 2017. We spent the entire session in 2017. Every week, we had a committee, House, Senate, working together. That's rare, by the way, but we did. We heard from a number of experts. We took public testimony from you know, people who felt that we need to get on top of this problem. We also heard from a number of people who felt that we should not be taking steps. Actually, let me back up and say there was one other thing that happened in January of 2017. Just before we went into session, we were given a new president in this country, right? And you probably remember that. And it became really clear to us that we could not expect action at the national level for quite a while, and that action would have to happen state by state, and ideally regionally, actually. And so as we started, you know, as we met in this joint committee, we looked at different methods of pricing carbon, and we decided that the way that would work most effectively for us would be to join California and the Canadian provinces of Ontario and Quebec in a program known as the Western Climate Initiative, which is a cap and trade, and invest. We call it a cap and invest kind of program that would essentially take where we are now in terms of our emissions, look at where we need to be by the year 2050 to meet our goals, create a downward slope that would take us from here to there, year by year by year, and require the large emitters of greenhouse gas pollution to have to purchase permits to be able to operate. And those permits would be less and less every year until we got to where we need to be in 2050. They would have to purchase those permits for the most part, and their purchasing of the permits could be done either directly here in Oregon or in a shared market that we would be sharing with these other jurisdictions. which is a way to sort of keep overhead costs down and to make it more efficient. And with those resources, we could then reinvest in ways that would help us to further decarbonize and to reduce the impact of carbon pricing on those least able to afford low-income people, communities of color, rural Oregonians. Those are the people who are hardest hit by energy costs and also the effects of climate change, to be honest. So by the end of that 2017 session, we decided we're going to go with a cap and trade program. And let's explore what those investments would look like, how it would work, what the effects would be on industry, on manufacturing, on transportation, on utilities. And we created work groups that were very broad. We had a lot of people participating in them. We had public hearings, generated thousands of pages of public testimony on, giving us recommendations on how to move forward, hours of public testimony in Salem and in other parts of the state. Ultimately, that led us to a bill that we were prepared to introduce in 2018, in February of just about a year ago. We knew we were not going to be able to pass it in that session. Actually, I'll tell you a little insider secret that I try not to talk about much, but we had when we committed to doing this cap and trade program, we assumed that we were going to move it in 2019 in the session that's about to come. And then, I don't know if you remember, Al Gore had a movie, what was it called?
Inconvenient Truth.
Inconvenient Truth. And the governor attended the opening of that. And so she announced it. She got so inspired by the movie that she announced to everyone, you know what, we're going to do this in 2018. And, I can tell you, I was taken aback. To get a bill of that magnitude ready in time, in a 6-month period, plus to get it through a short session. In the even-numbered years, our legislative sessions are just 4 weeks long, was going to be pretty daunting. But I will say, in retrospect, although I gave her a hard time for doing that, for going off the reservation, I did really appreciate that she did it, because it really forced us to work hard during the interim. And so in 2018, I do believe if we were in a long session in 2018, we could have gotten this thing passed. But by right around middle of January, I crafted a strategy that has the sort of technical name of Plan B. And Plan B had us, we would go through our hearings during the session and, get the bills referred to Ways and Means where they would sit. But in the meantime, we would create a path to really get this done in 2019, to commit dollars to create a new carbon office in the governor's office, to create a joint committee on carbon reduction, to authorize a number of studies that we knew were going to have to be done once the bill passed anyway. So we knew that we could get those things done during this interim and then still be on our original timeline, which was to get our new program up and running by 2021. And in fact, that is where we are. One other thing that we did as we were doing this work and crafting this legislation was we had our fingers crossed on how the election would turn out. And fortunately, it turned out well for us, for those who advocate for carbon action. And as you probably know, we now have supermajorities in both our chambers. And a supermajority is most important when you're passing a revenue bill, like a tax increase or a new fee, a major fee, that kind of thing.
How do you define a supermajority?
A supermajority is a 3/5 vote. So you can deliver a 3/5 vote just out of your caucus. So in the Senate, that's 18 out of 30, and in the House, that's 31. It's 36 out of 60. And that is where we landed. The way that we are crafting our Cap and Invest program, we don't need a supermajority actually, because it's not a tax per se. It's a program where entities, whether they're the largest manufacturers or fuel importers or Northwest Natural, et cetera, they have to purchase allowances, but they're not actually being taxed for their carbon. And so the legal ruling is that we don't actually need a supermajority. Now, let me back up and say I would love for us to have a supermajority. And when we had our joint committee on carbon reduction meeting during the year, that was a combination of both Democrats and Republicans. And I have not yet given up hope of getting a Republican, but it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge because, as I mentioned before, climate change and climate action has become just very political. The Cap and Invest kind of approach, carbon pricing in general, was a Republican idea at one point. It's sort of an economist way of doing things. And,
Market-based.
Yeah, it's market-based. But for the last 20 years or so, it has just become politically toxic and very polarizing. It's really interesting to see the polling on this issue. And I just saw some of the latest polling yesterday that was done here in Oregon. About 58% of Oregonians consider climate change to be a serious problem. If you look at a demographic that's under the age of 40, that goes up to 75%. We can see just demographically big differences between the parties. We see big differences urban and rural, but overall there is, there's pretty strong support for carbon action. For the kind of program that we're proposing, there's very strong support for it, actually. And if the legislature can pass this legislation, the chances of it being referred to the voters and then repealed is fairly low. So our focus really is on getting this passed. You may know that Washington State tried to do this at the ballot just this last, couple of this last election. To do it that way, where you are, gathering signatures and trying to get people to say yes to a new program, that's much, much harder than if the legislature passes it, works out the kinks, passes it, and then voters have to vote yes, repeal this. Voters like to vote no. If they're not 100% sure of something, they like to vote no. And so that's why if you think of a number of the referrals that we've had here in Oregon over the last few years, most of them have failed because it's easier to get people to vote no. So what is this program that we're looking at? Let me just say something about the kinds of investments that we're looking at. First of all, as I said, the big part, the carbon reduction part, and this is what really attracts me to the cap and invest kind of model, is that you have a steady year-by-year required reduction of emissions. The other way of doing this is through a carbon tax, where you put a price on the carbon and you hope that that will lead to reductions of uses. Economists love it, because they believe, if you're an economist, you believe that tax something and people will use less of it. And I'm not an economist, so I prefer the hard cap that declines over time. So that is one piece of it. I will say that there is an element in it of, as I said, entities have to purchase allowances, but not all of them will have to. First of all, this will only apply to the very largest of the emitters, those that are emitting 25,000 tons or more each year of greenhouse gases, or the equivalent. And there are some industries that are what we call emissions intensive and trade exposed, that we are not going to force them to purchase their allowances all right away. They're going to be on a sort of, we're going to put them on a diet where, in the first year they'll get 90 or 100% of their allowance, their permits for free, and then the next year, 90, 85, 80, 75, and such. Because we don't want to drive them out of business. We don't want to drive them out of the state. I mean, that's what we're really afraid of, is that they'll just move their operation from Oregon over to Idaho or somewhere else and pollute there. Because global warming, climate change is a global problem, it doesn't help us to have somebody move and emit somewhere else. So, our preference is to keep them here, get them under the program, and get them on this steady decline, becoming more and more efficient. So that's the cap part. The invest part, investments need to be used in 4 areas. One is carbon reduction, obviously, to create more efficiency, more weatherization of homes, more transit, incentives for electrification, investments in renewable generation. So that's one area. Another area, and that's a real primary area. But we also know that no matter what we do with climate change, even if, as we hope, we create this dynamite program and other states start following us. And I will say that if Oregon, when we do this, it will trigger a number of other states to follow us. We will be the first state after California. That is, as I like to say, the first normal state to do this carbon pricing. I'm sure that Washington will follow us within a year or so. Minnesota is poised. The New England states are already pricing their electricity, their power plants. They have a kind of it's like a cap and trade program. It's called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And they're talking about now moving into the transportation sector as well. So they will follow us. And we will really start making progress. But having said that, as you know, we're not going to stop climate change. We're living with the legacy of it. We're already seeing the effects of it. And so we need to do 2 things. We need to, first of all, try to get some or a lot of that carbon that's already up there in the atmosphere out of the atmosphere and sequestered and stored down here. What's the best way to sequester carbon?
Tree.
Trees.
Forests.
forests. And what is the one thing that Oregon does really, really well? It's grow trees. And we can be in that way, not only in pricing carbon, but in also in incentivizing healthier forests. We can be actually helping to solve this problem and turning the curve back. I will say it's not only our forests, it's also our marshlands, our rangelands are also really good at storing carbon. But they have to be, our agricultural practices, our land use practices have to be such that we're incentivizing that. But we know that we're already seeing the effects of longer, hotter fire seasons. We're seeing ocean acidification. We're seeing less water because of the hotter summers. And so we need, as a state, to be investing in ways to adapt to that new reality. We need to be strengthening our hillsides because we can expect more floods and more landslides. We have to strengthen our culverts to help with fish passage and because they're vulnerable to washouts, again, with the flooding. There are a number of things that we need to do to become more resilient in the face of climate change. And so that's another sort of bucket for investments. And the fourth bucket is transition assistance. Helping low-income people, as I mentioned before, that's a real priority. Low-income people, tribes, and communities of color to make sure that their homes are well insulated, that we're looking at perhaps a rebate of some sort on their gas price, their fuel consumption, especially those who are living in the rural areas. They're low income, they're in the rural areas, they don't have the alternative of transit. Looking at ways to sort of ease the transition for them until we're able to get them into electric cars. So those are our areas that we're looking at. We're paying a lot of attention to using this program as a way of investing in rural Oregon. Because rural Oregon, as you probably know, is not really benefiting from our economic recovery. And yet, when you're poor in rural Oregon, it's really tough. The winters are colder, the summers are hotter, you might have to drive more. You come from a resource-based economy that has gone away, and we need to find a way to replace that with renewable industry. One of the things about Oregon is we're not a state that generates fossil fuels. There are people that would like us to transport fossil fuels, which we are carefully crafting this program not to encourage, but rather to discourage. But we do have the capacity to really generate a lot of energy from renewable sources, wind, solar, geothermal, and all of those are located in the rural parts of the state. And so investing in renewables is actually a way to encourage investments in the rural parts of the state. So that's a really important part of this program. And probably, at least a fourth of the investments are going to go into rural Oregon. So as I mentioned, and I'll sort of wrap up and be happy to answer your questions. As I started, I said that in 6 weeks, we're hoping to pass this bill out of our joint committee. I am, as was mentioned, the Senate co-chair of this joint committee. My House counterpart is Representative Karin Power from Milwaukee, she has I think he he's 18 months old, kid, very smart land use lawyer. She's my counterpart in the House. We've been, crafting this legislation, which will be introduced when we go into session, and that's the new Joint Committee on Carbon will have its first meeting the week of Martin Luther King Day, so like the 24th, 25th, something like that. We'll have our first meeting. We'll probably have several weeks of hearings. I know we will. We'll have several weeks of hearings. We're going to get an updated report from the Oregon Climate Research Institute, the Oregon Global Warming Commission, but then really the bulk of our work will be spent having hearings on the bill. Let me say one other thing. You might wonder, so which agency is going to oversee this new program? And to that end, the governor is creating a new program, a new agency called the Oregon Climate, what's it called? Climate Action. The Oregon Climate Authority. I don't even remember the OCA. It's an unfortunate acronym, but the Oregon Climate Authority. And that's also something that we'll have to do this session. My committee will be doing is sort of creating that program and writing the authorities for that program. But what it's doing is it's taking our existing Oregon Department of Energy and giving it a real climate change focus. So it will be overseeing all of our existing energy programs, plus climate change. And from my perspective, I really applaud that move, and I really encouraged it. When I first became chair of the Environment Committee, the timing was great. I had just taken over from Jackie Dingfelder. I don't know if any of you know her. Like within a week, I was contacted by the British Embassy. Hey, how would you like to take a trip to London to look at some offshore wind? And I said, well, I don't know. Yes. Jackie has not spoken to me since. Anyway, I was the guest of the British Ministry of, it's called DEC, which is the Department of Energy and Climate Change. That they have done that. They did that back in 2012. Conservative government, actually, that took all their energy programs and they worked them through a climate change lens, which is really great. And that's what we're hoping to do as well. But the legislature itself will stay very involved in the rollout of the program. We are, as part of the legislation, we are making the Joint Committee on Climate an ongoing oversight committee, which will have the final say on how the investments are done and just auditing the effectiveness of the program. When California created their program back in, I don't know when it was, 2012, the legislature basically, their bill was a half a page long, and it directed their Air Resources Board to create a cap and trade program, period. And then the agency did everything. And it almost went down after that, because the legislature was not really involved and really had no ownership or really understood it. But they did manage to keep it going, and now actually it was just renewed with supermajorities of both chambers, and with support from most of the state's business organizations as well, I should say, which is great. But we knew up front that we couldn't do that. The legislature, legislators would never accept that. And seeing what happened in California, that was the wrong way to do it. that really the legislature needs to be involved in the development of this program and the oversight of this program. So that's kind of what we're heading into. So, you know, what we're hoping is that we'll get this bill out of committee in 6 weeks and to the floor for votes in the first 2 months of this session. Because we have a lot of other important work to do. We don't want this getting bogged down in some of the other work. These bills are ready. This bill will be ready to go, and we want to pass it quickly and move on. And with that takes us to where we are today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have about, you know, any of the details of the bill, or any insider baseball, or how you can help, or, you know, any of that. Yes.